I never thought I would find myself standing in a courtroom facing my own parents in a lawsuit over my grandfather's inheritance. The moment I walked through those heavy wooden doors, every eye in the room turned toward me. The judge looked up from her papers, her expression shifting from professional composure to complete bewilderment. Her gavel froze halfway to the bench as she stared at me with wide eyes. "Wait!" she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "The charges are against you." The entire courtroom fell into stunned quiet. My billionaire grandfather had left me his entire $60 million estate, while my parents, who had abandoned me 20 years ago to chase money overseas, received nothing. Now they wanted it all. The story began when I was 8 years old, standing on the front porch of my childhood home in Denver, watching my parents Mark and Linda load their suitcases into a taxi. They had just received what they called the opportunity of a lifetime from some business contacts in Dubai, a real estate venture that promised millions in returns within 6 months. They promised they would send for me once they got settled, or come back to get me by Christmas at the latest. That Christmas came and went. So did the next 19. My grandfather, Samuel Hartwell, was 62, then a self-made construction mogul who had built his empire from a single pickup truck and a toolbox. When my parents left, he didn't hesitate to take me in. Samuel never made me feel like a burden or an obligation. Instead, he treated me like the son he had always wanted his own boy to become. Every morning at 6:30, we would take walks around his neighborhood in Cherry Creek, where he would point out different architectural styles and explain how buildings were constructed. He had this way of making even the most complex engineering concepts sound simple and fascinating. Samuel owned Hartwell Construction, which had built half the office towers in downtown Denver over the past 30 years. On weekends, he would take me to active job sites, always making sure I wore a hard hat and stayed close to him. He introduced me to foremen and workers like I was his business partner, teaching me about project management, quality control, and treating employees with respect. "Gene," he would say, "anyone can throw money at a problem, but it takes character to build something that lasts." Our evenings were quiet and comfortable. Samuel would help me with homework at his massive oak dining table, the same table where he reviewed construction blueprints during the day. He never once complained about algebra or science projects, even when they took hours to complete. When I struggled with reading comprehension in 4th grade, he patiently worked with me every night until my grades improved. He attended every school play parent-teacher conference and soccer game, taking photos with an old film camera he carried everywhere. Samuel never spoke badly about my parents, even when I asked difficult questions about why they had not come home yet. "Everyone finds their path at their own pace," he would say. "Your mom and dad will figure things out when they are ready. Until then, you and I have important work to do right here." He made me feel like staying with him was not just temporary childcare, but a genuine partnership in building something meaningful together. As I grew older, Samuel began teaching me about business operations and financial responsibility. When I turned 16, he gave me a part-time job at his company, starting in the mailroom, and working my way up through different departments during summers and school breaks. I learned payroll, project scheduling, client relations, and supply chain management. Samuel never gave me special treatment, because I was his grandson. If anything, he held me to higher standards, knowing that other employees were watching to see if nepotism would influence his decisions. When I graduated high school, Samuel encouraged me to pursue my own interests, rather than automatically joining the family business. I studied mechanical engineering at Colorado State University, partly because I wanted to understand the technical side of construction, but mostly because Samuel had taught me to value education and independence. He paid for my tuition without ever making me feel indebted or pressured to take over his company. After college, I moved to Chicago and worked for a mid-sized engineering firm that specialized in sustainable building design. Samuel was proud that I had struck out on my own, even though it meant living 800 miles away from him. We talked on the phone twice a week, and I visited Denver every few months. He would always ask about my projects and seemed genuinely interested in my career development. 3 years ago, Samuel's health began declining. First, it was shortness of breath that he attributed to altitude and age. Then came the chest pains and fatigue that he tried to hide during our phone calls. When his doctor diagnosed him with congestive heart failure, Samuel finally admitted he needed help managing his daily routine and medical appointments. Without hesitation, I gave notice at my job in Chicago and moved back to Denver. Those final 3 years were precious in ways I had never anticipated. I cooked Samuel's favorite meals, drove him to doctor visits, and organized his medications. We spent hours talking about his life, his regrets, and his hopes for the future. He told me stories about building his first house in 1978, about meeting my grandmother at a church dance, and about the day my father was born. Samuel also shared his disappointments about how Mark had turned out, always chasing get-rich-quick schemes, instead of building something solid and lasting. During Samuel's final weeks, I slept in the chair next to his hospital bed, holding his hand through the long nights when pain kept him awake. His last words to me were spoken just hours before he passed away peacefully on a Tuesday morning in March. "You stayed when it mattered, son." He whispered, his voice barely audible above the humming medical equipment. "That is worth more than all the money in the world." He squeezed my hand one final time and closed his eyes forever. Samuel's funeral was held on a crisp Friday morning at St. John's Cathedral in downtown Denver. I had organized everything myself, from the flower arrangements to the guest list, which included hundreds of employees, business associates, and community leaders whose lives Samuel had touched over the decades. The service was beautiful and dignified, exactly the kind of tribute Samuel would have wanted. I delivered the eulogy, sharing stories about his generosity, work ethic, and unwavering commitment to treating everyone with respect, regardless of their social status or wealth. Just as the last guests were leaving the cemetery, a black sedan pulled up near the gravesite. Two people emerged, whom I had not seen in person for 20 years. Mark and Linda. My parents walked toward me, wearing expensive-looking clothes that somehow appeared ill-fitting and uncomfortable. Mark wore a charcoal suit that looked like it had been purchased recently, while Linda clutched a designer purse and wore dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. They approached me awkwardly, as if uncertain whether to offer condolences or act familiar. "Gene," Mark said, extending his hand for a formal handshake rather than a hug. "Sorry we could not make it sooner. International travel is complicated these days." Linda nodded silently, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, though I noticed her makeup remained perfectly intact. They had heard about Samuel's death through my cousin Jake, who had posted about the funeral on social media. Apparently, they had flown back from Dubai within 48 hours of learning about Samuel's passing. During the reception at Samuel's house, I watched my parents circulate among the remaining guests, introducing themselves as Samuel's son and daughter-in-law, and speaking in hushed tones about family matters and future arrangements. They seemed particularly interested in talking with Margaret Stone, Samuel's longtime attorney, though she politely deflected their questions about estate planning and legal procedures. Mark kept glancing around the house, taking mental inventory of artwork, furniture, and decorative items, while Linda asked pointed questions about property values and recent home sales in the neighborhood. That evening, my parents checked into the Brown Palace Hotel downtown, explaining that they needed a few days to process their grief and handle family business. Over dinner, at an expensive restaurant they had chosen, they talked extensively about their overseas ventures and how difficult it had been to maintain their business interests while staying connected to family back home. Linda mentioned several times how much they had sacrificed by living abroad, always with the intention of building wealth that would benefit the entire family someday. Margaret called Monday morning to schedule the formal reading of Samuel's will for Wednesday afternoon at her law office. She invited me, my parents, and two of Samuel's longtime employees, who had been mentioned in the will as beneficiaries of smaller bequests. When I arrived at Margaret's office, my parents were already seated in the conference room speaking quietly with each other and appearing confident about the proceedings ahead. Mark and Linda had clearly spent considerable time planning how they would handle their inheritance. During the 20 minutes before Margaret began reading the will, they discussed vacation properties, they wanted to purchase luxury cars, they had been researching, and investment strategies for managing what they assumed would be their substantial windfall. Mark mentioned wanting to buy a yacht for entertaining business clients, while Linda talked about finally being able to afford the designer clothes and jewelry she had been coveting for years. Margaret entered the room carrying a thick legal folder and wearing the serious expression she reserved for important family matters. She had been Samuel's attorney for over 15 years and had helped him update his will multiple times as circumstances changed. Margaret explained that Samuel had been very specific about his final wishes and had spent considerable time ensuring that his estate plan reflected his values and priorities. The bombshell came when Margaret read the key provision of Samuel's will aloud. Samuel Hartwell had left his entire estate valued at approximately $60 million to his grandson, Gene Hartwell. This included his construction company, his primary residence in Cherry Creek, a vacation cabin in Aspen, a condo in Scottsdale, all investment accounts, and every other asset he owned. My parents would inherit nothing whatsoever. The silence that followed was deafening. Mark's face drained of color as he processed what he had just heard. Linda's mouth fell open, and she began shaking her head in disbelief. "This cannot be right," Mark finally stammered. "There must be some mistake. We are his children. We are his flesh and blood. Gene is just a grandson." His voice grew louder and more agitated as the reality sank in. "This is impossible. He is just a kid. What does he know about managing this kind of money or running a business?" Linda began crying, though her tears seemed more angry than sad. "This is not fair," she sobbed. "We spent 20 years building our future overseas, so we could eventually come back and take care of him. Everything we did was for this family. We were planning to move back to Denver and help him with the business. We had so many plans for spending time together and making up for lost years." Margaret remained calm and professional throughout their outburst. She explained that Samuel had updated his will 6 times over the past 10 years, each revision giving Gene a larger share while reducing what his parents would receive. The final version, signed just 8 months before Samuel's death, had eliminated Mark and Linda completely. Samuel had been very clear about his reasoning and had left a sealed letter explaining his decision. I sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just happened. I had expected Samuel to leave me something meaningful, perhaps the cabin in Aspen, where we had spent many happy weekends, or a portion of his stock portfolio, to help with my future financial security. I had never imagined inheriting everything, and I felt a crushing weight of responsibility, along with my grief. Margaret handed me the sealed envelope containing Samuel's letter, but I was too emotionally overwhelmed to open it immediately. Mark demanded to see documentation proving the will's validity and asked pointed questions about Samuel's mental state when he made these decisions. Margaret patiently explained that Samuel had undergone cognitive testing as recently as 6 months ago and had been declared mentally competent by 2 independent physicians. The will had been witnessed by 3 people and notarized according to Colorado state law. There were no grounds for questioning its legitimacy based on mental incapacity or procedural errors. As we left Margaret's office, my parents were whispering urgently to each other about their options and next steps. Mark kept repeating that there had to be some legal recourse for children who had been unfairly disinherited. Linda mentioned consulting with other attorneys to get second opinions about contesting the will. They seemed to view this as a temporary setback rather than Samuel's final decision about how his life's work should be distributed. That evening, I tried calling my parents at their hotel to discuss the situation and possibly find some way to share the inheritance, despite Samuel's explicit wishes. My calls went straight to voicemail, and my text messages received no responses. I wanted to talk through their shock and disappointment, perhaps offering to help them financially, even though the will gave me no legal obligation to do so. Samuel had raised me to be generous and fair, and I felt conflicted about receiving everything while his own children got nothing. My cousin Jake called Friday morning with disturbing news about my parents' activities since the will reading. Jake worked as a concierge at the Brown Palace and had overheard Mark and Linda making numerous phone calls to law firms around Denver, apparently shopping for attorneys who specialized in contesting wills and estate litigation. They had also been seen meeting with strangers in the hotel lobby, including someone Jake recognized as a private investigator who had worked on several high-profile divorce cases in the past. Through Jake, I learned that my parents were spending money lavishly, despite their claims of financial hardship from 20 years overseas. They were ordering room service meals that cost more than most people's weekly grocery budgets, charging expensive bottles of wine to their room, and taking taxi rides all over the city, instead of using more economical transportation options. Jake mentioned that the hotel staff was beginning to worry about their ability to pay for their extended stay, especially since they had already been there for over a week, with no checkout date scheduled. I decided to read Samuel's letter that weekend, hoping it might provide guidance for dealing with this difficult family situation. Samuel's handwriting was shaky, but still legible, filling 3 pages of his personal stationery. The letter began with an expression of love for me and pride in the man I had become, but quickly shifted to explain his reasoning for the inheritance decision. Samuel wrote that he had been testing Mark and Linda's commitment to family for years, through various subtle means. Whenever Samuel had health scares or medical procedures, Margaret would call my parents to inform them about his condition and suggest they might want to visit or at least call to check on him. My parents consistently responded that they were too busy with important business deals to travel, but they would send flowers or call when they had time. The flowers never arrived, and the phone calls were rare and brief. Samuel also revealed that he had secretly offered to pay for my parents' travel expenses to visit Denver multiple times over the past decade, including Christmas holidays, his 70th birthday celebration, and the anniversary of my grandmother's death. Mark and Linda always declined these offers, claiming they were on the verge of major business breakthroughs that required their constant attention. Samuel eventually realized that his son and daughter-in-law were only interested in his money, not his relationship or his well-being. The letter detailed how proud Samuel was of my character and work ethic, noting that I had never asked him for financial help, even when I was struggling to pay for college, or when I left my job in Chicago to care for him. Samuel wrote that he wanted his legacy to support someone who understood the value of hard work, loyalty, and genuine human connection, rather than someone who viewed family relationships as financial opportunities. Samuel's final paragraphs expressed his hope that I would use the inheritance wisely, not just for personal comfort, but to help others who needed support and opportunities. He specifically mentioned his desire to see scholarships established for young people aging out of foster care, since he knew what it felt like to be responsible for raising a child without much family support. Samuel also encouraged me to continue growing the construction business in ways that would create good jobs for hard-working people throughout Colorado. Monday morning, Margaret called with troubling news about my parents' legal maneuvering. They had hired David Morrison, one of Denver's most aggressive litigators who specialized in family estate disputes, and had a reputation for using questionable tactics to break wills that favored non-traditional beneficiaries. Morrison had already filed preliminary paperwork, challenging Samuel's will on grounds of undue influence, claiming that I had manipulated Samuel's mental state and isolated him from his biological children during his final years. Margaret explained that Morrison's strategy would likely involve portraying me as a calculating opportunist who had deliberately prevented my parents from maintaining contact with Samuel, while systematically poisoning his mind against them. This narrative would require them to prove that Samuel's decision was not based on 20 years of their absence and neglect, but rather on my recent manipulation of a vulnerable, elderly man. Margaret warned me that Morrison was skilled at twisting facts and presenting compelling alternative explanations for events that seemed straightforward. The legal challenge would be expensive and emotionally draining, potentially taking years to resolve, even though Samuel's will was clearly valid and properly executed. Morrison specialized in creating enough doubt about circumstances to force favorable settlements, since many inheritors preferred to share their inheritance rather than endure prolonged litigation and public scrutiny. Margaret assured me that we had strong evidence supporting Samuel's mental competency and his long-standing disappointment with Mark and Linda's behavior, but she cautioned that family estate disputes often became ugly and unpredictable. I began to understand the full magnitude of what I was facing. My parents were not simply disappointed about the inheritance. They were preparing to wage legal war against me using every available resource and tactic. They had apparently convinced themselves that I was the villain in this situation, rather than acknowledging their own choices and behavior over the past 2 decades. I felt a mixture of sadness and anger about their willingness to destroy our family relationships completely, rather than accept responsibility for the consequences of their long absence. That week, I also received several threatening phone calls from people claiming to represent my parents' interests. One caller suggested that I should do the right thing and share the inheritance equally before the situation escalated further. Another caller, who identified himself as a family advocate, warned me that contesting Samuel's will would expose embarrassing personal information about my relationship with my grandfather and the real reasons behind my parents' extended absence from Denver. 2 weeks later, I woke up to find 3 news vans parked outside my house and reporters knocking on my door at 6:30 in the morning. My parents had apparently decided to take their case to the court of public opinion by granting an exclusive interview to Channel 7 News. The story aired during the previous evening's broadcast under the headline, "Elderly Billionaire's Will Sparks Family Battle," and portrayed Mark and Linda as grieving children who had been unfairly cut off by a manipulative nephew. The news segment featured carefully edited clips of my parents, expressing their shock and disappointment about Samuel's will, along with their claims about being prevented from maintaining contact with him during his final years. Mark appeared sincere and emotional as he described their attempts to stay connected with Samuel while building their business overseas, claiming that I had systematically blocked their phone calls and discouraged Samuel from inviting them to visit Denver. Linda tearfully explained how much they had sacrificed by living abroad, always planning to return home and care for Samuel in his old age. The initial media coverage was sympathetic to my parents' perspective, partly because their story fit a familiar narrative about family greed and elder abuse. The reporters had not yet investigated the actual facts about my parents' 20-year absence or their reasons for suddenly returning to Denver after Samuel's death. Channel 7 presented the inheritance dispute as a simple case of biological children being cheated out of their rightful legacy by a calculating relative who had manipulated a vulnerable old man. Within hours of the broadcast, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from other news outlets requesting interviews and comments about the allegations. I received dozens of angry messages on social media from strangers who had seen the news story and decided I was a heartless opportunist who had taken advantage of my grandfather's declining mental state. Several people left voicemail messages containing death threats and promises to make me pay for what I had supposedly done to my own family. However, the media attention also attracted the interest of investigative reporter Sarah Chen from the Denver Post, who specialized in exposing fraud and corruption in high-profile legal cases. Sarah began digging deeper into my parents' background and quickly discovered inconsistencies in their public statements about their overseas business ventures and their relationship with Samuel during his final years. Sarah's research revealed that Mark and Linda had been involved in at least 4 failed business schemes during their 20 years abroad, leaving behind unpaid debts and angry investors in Dubai, Singapore, and Hong Kong. Their most recent venture had been a cryptocurrency trading platform that collapsed just months before Samuel's death, wiping out the savings of dozens of small investors who had trusted them with their money. Rather than successful international entrepreneurs, my parents appeared to be serial con artists who moved from one country to another when their schemes fell apart. More importantly, Sarah obtained phone records and email correspondence, proving that I had actually tried repeatedly to include my parents in Samuel's medical care and end-of-life planning. I had sent them detailed updates about his health condition, invited them to participate in video calls with his doctors, and offered to arrange travel accommodations if they wanted to visit him in the hospital. My parents had consistently declined these invitations, usually responding that they were too busy with critical business negotiations to leave their current location. Sarah also interviewed Samuel's longtime employees' neighbors and friends who provided a very different picture of my character and relationship with Samuel than the one my parents were promoting. These witnesses described how I had moved back to Denver, specifically to care for Samuel, giving up a promising engineering career in Chicago without any guarantee of financial compensation. They spoke about seeing me drive Samuel to medical appointments, grocery shopping for him when he became too weak to go out alone, and spending countless hours keeping him company during his final months. The turning point in media coverage came when Sarah published a comprehensive investigative piece titled "The Real Story Behind the Hartwell Estate Battle." Her article included interviews with business associates in Dubai who described Mark and Linda as unreliable partners who had disappeared overnight when their latest venture collapsed. Sarah also obtained documentation proving that my parents had been aware of Samuel's declining health for over 2 years, but had made no effort to visit him or even send greeting cards on his birthdays. Channel 7 was forced to air a correction, acknowledging that their initial report had not included crucial facts about the case. Other news outlets began investigating the story more thoroughly, and the narrative gradually shifted from "greedy nephew steals inheritance" to "absent children return for money after decades of neglecting dying father." The death threats and angry messages gradually decreased as public opinion turned in my favor, though the legal battle was just beginning. Morrison filed the formal lawsuit 3 weeks after the will reading, claiming that Samuel had lacked mental capacity when he updated his will, and that I had used undue influence to manipulate his decisions. The lawsuit also alleged that I had committed elder abuse by isolating Samuel from his family and preventing him from making informed choices about his estate planning. Morrison demanded that Samuel's will be declared invalid and that his estate be divided equally among his biological children and grandchildren. The legal proceedings attracted even more media attention, with reporters attending every hearing and filing daily updates about the case's progress. Judge Patricia Williams was assigned to oversee the trial, and her reputation for fairness and thorough preparation gave me some confidence about receiving a just outcome. However, Morrison was known for his theatrical courtroom style and his ability to sway juries with emotional appeals, even when the facts did not support his client's claims. The stress of the lawsuit began affecting every aspect of my life. I was spending thousands of dollars per week on legal fees, and the uncertainty about the inheritance made it impossible to make important decisions about Samuel's business or properties. My girlfriend Emma, whom I had been dating for 2 years, struggled to cope with the constant media attention and public scrutiny. She received harassing phone calls at work and encountered hostile strangers who recognized her as my girlfriend and blamed her for supporting my supposedly fraudulent behavior. Emma and I had several difficult conversations about whether our relationship could survive the ongoing legal battle and its impact on our future plans. She loved me and believed in my innocence, but the stress of being associated with such a controversial case was affecting her career and emotional well-being. I began to question whether I should simply offer my parents a settlement to end the litigation, even though it would validate their false accusations and betray Samuel's explicit wishes about how his legacy should be handled. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in November, exactly 8 months after Samuel's death. The courtroom was packed with reporters, curious spectators, and supporters from both sides. My parents sat at the plaintiff's table with Morrison dressed conservatively and projecting an image of respectable grief. Morrison had clearly coached them on courtroom behavior, and they appeared subdued and dignified rather than angry or desperate. Morrison's opening statement painted a compelling picture of loving parents who had made enormous sacrifices to build financial security for their family, only to be shut out of their father's final years by a manipulative grandson who had seized control of his medical care and isolated him from outside contact. Morrison claimed that Samuel's mental state had been severely compromised by medication and depression, making him vulnerable to psychological manipulation by someone he trusted completely. Margaret's opening statement focused on the documented evidence of my parents' 20-year absence from Samuel's life and their sudden return only after learning about his death. She explained that Samuel had been mentally sharp until his final weeks and had made careful, deliberate decisions about his estate based on years of observing his family members' priorities and character. Margaret emphasized that inheritance is not an automatic entitlement based on biological relationships, but a privilege that must be earned through demonstrated love and loyalty. Morrison called several witnesses who testified about Samuel's declining health and possible mental confusion during his final years. These witnesses included a former housekeeper who claimed she had overheard me making disparaging comments about my parents and discouraging Samuel from contacting them. Morrison also presented a psychiatrist who had never treated Samuel, but who offered theoretical opinions about how chronic illness and isolation could affect elderly patients' judgment and decision-making abilities. However, Morrison's case began unraveling during cross-examination when Margaret revealed significant inconsistencies in the witnesses' testimonies. The former housekeeper admitted that she had been fired by Samuel for stealing jewelry and had been bitter about losing her job. The psychiatrist acknowledged that he had no direct knowledge of Samuel's mental condition and was basing his opinions entirely on hypothetical scenarios rather than medical evidence. Morrison's strategy became increasingly desperate as Margaret presented evidence contradicting his central claims. Phone records proved that I had facilitated dozens of calls between my parents and Samuel, often staying on the line to help Samuel operate the video calling technology when his arthritis made it difficult for him to use his phone independently. Email correspondence showed that my parents had declined numerous invitations to visit Denver, usually responding within hours to explain why their business commitments made travel impossible. The most damaging testimony for Morrison's case came when Linda took the witness stand and began describing her supposed daily phone calls with Samuel to check on his health and emotional well-being. Under Margaret's cross-examination, Linda claimed that she had spoken with Samuel at least 3 times per week during his final year, always asking detailed questions about his medical treatments and offering emotional support during his illness. Margaret then presented phone records showing that Linda had actually called Samuel only 11 times during the entire previous year, with most calls lasting less than 5 minutes, and several going directly to voicemail without any attempt to call back later. When confronted with this evidence, Linda became flustered and began changing her story, claiming that most of their communication had occurred through text messages and emails rather than phone calls. Margaret's cross-examination revealed that Linda could not accurately recall basic details about Samuel's medical condition, including the names of his doctors, the medications he was taking, or even which hospital he had been admitted to during his final weeks. Linda also could not explain why she and Mark had never sent flowers, greeting cards, or care packages during Samuel's extended illness, especially since they claimed to be deeply concerned about his well-being. Morrison made a critical error during his redirect examination of Linda when he began asking leading questions about conversations between my parents and their attorney regarding strategy for the lawsuit. In his eagerness to rehabilitate Linda's credibility, Morrison inadvertently revealed that he had coached his clients to embellish their relationship with Samuel and to present false information about their communication patterns during his final years. Judge Williams immediately called for a sidebar conference and questioned Morrison about potential suborning of perjury. Morrison realized his mistake, but could not undo the damage he had caused to his client's credibility. The courtroom atmosphere became tense as spectators and reporters sensed that Morrison's case was collapsing due to his own tactical errors. Margaret then began presenting her most compelling evidence, starting with video recordings that Samuel had made over the past 5 years, explaining his thoughts about inheritance and family relationships. These videos had been stored in Samuel's personal safe and had never been mentioned to anyone except Margaret, who had helped Samuel set up the recording equipment in his home office. The videos showed Samuel sitting at his desk, speaking directly to the camera in a clear, articulate voice that demonstrated his mental sharpness and emotional stability. In these recordings, Samuel described his repeated attempts to maintain contact with Mark and Linda, his disappointment about their extended absence from important family events, and his growing appreciation for my dedication and character. In one particularly powerful video recorded just 6 weeks before his death, Samuel addressed the inheritance question directly. "I know some people will question my decision to leave everything to Jean," he said, looking directly into the camera. "But inheritance should go to the person who has proven their love through actions, not just genetics. Jean gave up his own career to take care of me when I needed help. Mark and Linda had 20 years to show they cared about our relationship, and they chose money over family every single time." The courtroom fell silent as Judge Williams played these videos, and I could see several reporters taking extensive notes about Samuel's clear mental state and his thoughtful reasoning about the inheritance decision. Morrison objected repeatedly to the admission of the video evidence, but Judge Williams ruled that the recordings were relevant and authentic representations of Samuel's state of mind when he made his estate planning decisions. After 3 days of testimony, Judge Williams called both legal teams to a private chambers meeting that would prove to be the turning point in the entire case. As we gathered around her conference table, Judge Williams made an unexpected announcement that stunned everyone in the room, including Margaret and Morrison. Before we proceed with closing arguments, Judge Williams said, "I need to disclose a personal connection to this case that I believe is relevant to the proceedings." She explained that 25 years earlier, when she was a young public defender working in East Denver, Samuel had donated materials and labor to rebuild the community center in her old neighborhood after gang violence had destroyed the original building. Judge Williams described how Samuel had learned about the community center's destruction through a newspaper article and had contacted the city directly to offer his assistance. He never sought publicity or tax benefits for his donation, simply believing that children in that neighborhood deserved a safe place to play and learn after school. Samuel's construction crew had worked for free during evenings and weekends to complete the project, and the rebuilt community center had served hundreds of families over the following decades. "I was involved in that project because I was helping the community organize legal paperwork for the reconstruction," Judge Williams continued. "I met Mr. Hartwell several times during that process, and I was impressed by his genuine commitment to helping people he had never met and would probably never see again. He was not looking for recognition or business opportunities. He simply saw a need and decided to fill it." Judge Williams explained that she had followed Samuel's philanthropic activities over the years through newspaper coverage and community newsletters. She knew about his scholarship programs for underprivileged students, his support for local youth sports leagues, and his practice of hiring ex-offenders and helping them rebuild their lives through stable employment. She also knew that Samuel's son and daughter-in-law had been notably absent from public events and charity functions where Samuel was honored for his community contributions. Morrison immediately objected to Judge Williams continuing with the case, claiming that her personal knowledge of Samuel created an unfair bias in my favor. However, Judge Williams calmly explained that her familiarity with Samuel's character actually helped her evaluate the credibility of witnesses and evidence more accurately. Morrison's objection had the opposite effect of what he intended, drawing more attention to Samuel's charitable nature and making my parents' 20-year absence appear even more inexcusable. Judge Williams also revealed that her initial shock when she saw me as the defendant, rather than the plaintiff, had been based on her assumption that Samuel's biological children would be the ones inheriting his estate, and defending his will against challenges from distant relatives. She had expected Mark and Linda to be sitting at the defendant's table, not filing lawsuits against the grandson who had cared for Samuel during his final years. This revelation provided crucial context for understanding Judge Williams' reaction during our first courtroom appearance. Her surprise had not been about the legal merits of the case, but about discovering that Samuel's own children were the ones challenging his final wishes, rather than supporting them. Judge Williams had known Samuel well enough to understand that he would never have made careless or impulsive decisions about something as important as his legacy. Morrison realized that his case was beyond salvaging and made one final desperate attempt to create sympathy for his clients. He requested permission to present additional testimony about my parents' financial hardships and emotional trauma from being disinherited by their own father. Morrison argued that regardless of their past mistakes, Mark and Linda deserved some consideration as Samuel's biological children, who had been completely excluded from his estate. Judge Williams denied Morrison's request, noting that the trial was about the validity of Samuel's will, rather than the fairness of his decisions. She reminded Morrison that parents have no legal obligation to leave inheritances to their children, and that Samuel had clearly explained his reasoning through both written documentation and video recordings. The law supported Samuel's right to distribute his estate according to his own values and preferences. Outside the courthouse during a lunch recess, my parents made one final attempt to manipulate me emotionally, rather than continuing with their failing legal strategy. Mark approached me near the courthouse steps, away from the reporters and spectators, who were following every development in the trial. "Gene," he said, his voice breaking with apparent emotion, "we know we made mistakes. We thought we were building something that would benefit the whole family, including you. We never meant to hurt Dad or abandon our responsibilities. We just got caught up in opportunities that seemed too good to pass up, and then we got trapped overseas by circumstances beyond our control." Linda joined the conversation, tears streaming down her face as she described their regrets about missing so many years of family life. "We know we cannot change the past," she said, "but we hoped we could come home and make things right with Dad before it was too late. We never imagined that he would die while we were still trying to figure out how to rebuild our relationship with him." Mark continued the emotional appeal by acknowledging that I had earned Samuel's gratitude and respect through my care and dedication. However, he argued that blood relationships should count for something, and that Samuel's decision to completely disinherit his own children was too extreme and vindictive. He suggested that we could settle the lawsuit by agreeing to split the inheritance 3 ways, allowing everyone to benefit from Samuel's legacy while avoiding further family destruction. I listened to their pleas with a mixture of sadness and anger, recognizing that even in this moment of apparent vulnerability and remorse, my parents were still trying to manipulate me into giving them money, rather than accepting responsibility for their choices. Their apology focused on their own regrets and financial desires, rather than acknowledging the pain they had caused Samuel or expressing genuine concern for the relationships they had damaged. Judge Williams delivered her ruling the following morning in a packed courtroom that included family members, reporters, and dozens of spectators who had been following the case through media coverage. Her decision was thorough, decisive, and left no doubt about the validity of Samuel's will or the appropriateness of his inheritance decisions. This case represents a fundamental question about the nature of family relationships and the meaning of inheritance. Judge Williams began. The plaintiffs argue that biological connection creates an automatic entitlement to a parent's estate, regardless of the quality or consistency of the family relationship. The defendant argues that inheritance should be based on demonstrated love, loyalty, and character, rather than genetic ties alone. Judge Williams systematically addressed each of Morrison's claims about undue influence and mental incapacity, noting that Samuel had been examined by multiple physicians who confirmed his cognitive abilities remained intact throughout his final years. She emphasized that Samuel's video recordings demonstrated clear thinking and emotional stability with no evidence of confusion, depression, or vulnerability to manipulation. Mr. Hartwell was a successful businessman who made careful, deliberate decisions throughout his life. Judge Williams continued. His estate planning reflected the same thoughtful approach he brought to all important matters. He observed his family members' behavior over many years and made inheritance decisions based on their demonstrated priorities and character traits. Judge Williams specifically addressed the 20-year absence of Mark and Linda from Samuel's life, noting that their claims about business commitments overseas were contradicted by evidence of failed ventures and questionable financial practices. She pointed out that even if their business activities had been legitimate and successful, choosing money over family relationships for 2 decades demonstrated exactly the kind of values that Samuel wanted to discourage through his inheritance decisions. The evidence shows that Gene Hartwell sacrificed his own career opportunities to provide care and companionship for his grandfather during his final years, Judge Williams stated. This was not a calculated strategy to secure inheritance, but a natural expression of love and loyalty that had been developing throughout their relationship since Gene was 8 years old. Judge Williams dismissed the lawsuit completely and ordered Mark and Linda to pay court costs and legal fees for bringing a frivolous case based on false allegations. She also referred Morrison to the State Bar Association for potential disciplinary action regarding his coaching of witnesses to provide misleading testimony. The ruling was a complete vindication of Samuel's wishes and my character. But the real transformation began in the weeks that followed, as my parents finally confronted the consequences of their choices and behavior. The public nature of the trial had exposed their pattern of failed business ventures and abandonment of family responsibilities, making it impossible for them to continue blaming others for their problems. 2 days after Judge Williams announced her decision, Mark called me to request a private meeting without lawyers or media attention. We met at a small coffee shop in downtown Denver, where Mark broke down completely and offered the first genuine apology I had ever heard from him. He admitted that their overseas ventures had been motivated more by greed and restlessness than by any realistic business plan, and that they had convinced themselves that Samuel would always be available whenever they decided to return home. Mark acknowledged that they had been living in denial about the damage their absence was causing to family relationships, always assuming they could make up for lost time once their financial situation improved. He described the shame and regret he felt about missing my high school graduation, my college years, and all the important moments when Samuel needed support and companionship from his own children. Linda joined us for a second conversation the following week, and her apology was equally heartfelt and comprehensive. She admitted that she had been jealous of my close relationship with Samuel and had resented the fact that I had received the love and attention she had given up through her own choices. Linda also acknowledged that their lawsuit had been motivated primarily by financial desperation rather than genuine grief or family loyalty. My parents' transformation was not immediate or easy, but it was authentic enough to provide a foundation for rebuilding some kind of relationship between us. I made it clear that the inheritance was not available for sharing, and that I intended to honor Samuel's wishes completely. However, I also offered them an opportunity to participate in family therapy if they were genuinely committed to understanding and changing the patterns that had led to this crisis. The family therapy sessions were difficult and emotionally draining, but they provided a safe space for expressing years of accumulated anger, disappointment, and regret. Mark and Linda had to confront the reality of how their choices had affected not just me and Samuel, but also their own sense of identity and purpose. They began to understand that their constant pursuit of financial success had cost them the relationships and experiences that actually create lasting happiness and fulfillment. I announced my plans for Samuel's inheritance at a press conference 6 months after the trial ended. The Samuel Hartwell Foundation would provide scholarships and support services for young people aging out of foster care, helping them transition to independent adult life with educational opportunities and career training. I also plan to expand Samuel's construction business by creating apprenticeship programs for at-risk youth and formerly incarcerated individuals who needed stable employment and job skills. The Foundation's first major project would be rebuilding and upgrading community centers in underserved neighborhoods throughout Colorado, continuing Samuel's legacy of using construction skills to benefit people who needed safe spaces for learning and recreation. I wanted every project to reflect Samuel's values of hard work, quality craftsmanship, and genuine concern for community well-being. Emma and I got engaged 8 months after the trial ended, and she became actively involved in planning and managing the Foundation's programs. Our wedding was small and private, held at Samuel's cabin in Aspen, with only close friends and family members present. Mark and Linda attended the ceremony, and while our relationship remained somewhat strained and formal, we were beginning to build new patterns of communication and mutual respect. On the first anniversary of Samuel's death, I visited his grave with Emma and placed fresh flowers on the headstone, along with a written report about the Foundation's progress and achievements. I told Samuel about the 43 young people who had received scholarships during the Foundation's first year, the 12 construction apprentices who had found permanent employment with local contractors, and the 3 community centers that were being rebuilt according to his original design principles. Standing beside Samuel's grave, I reflected on the profound life lessons his inheritance had taught me about the difference between biological family and chosen family. Samuel had shown me that real inheritance is not about money or property, but about values, character, and the responsibility to use whatever resources you have been given to help others who need support and opportunity. I realized that the lawsuit and media attention, while painful and stressful, had actually served an important purpose by forcing me to articulate and defend the principles that Samuel had taught me throughout my life. The trial had been a public examination of different approaches to family relationships and personal priorities, and the outcome had validated Samuel's belief that love and loyalty should be based on actions rather than genetics alone. My parents continued participating in family therapy and gradually began volunteering with the Foundation's programs, starting with small administrative tasks and eventually becoming more involved in direct service activities. Mark used his business experience to help young adults develop financial literacy skills, while Linda provided emotional support and mentoring for teenage girls transitioning out of foster care. Their involvement was not motivated by any hope of accessing Samuel's money, but by a genuine desire to honor his memory and contribute something meaningful to the community he had cared about. Mark and Linda were learning later in life than most people that real satisfaction comes from giving rather than taking, and from building relationships rather than accumulating wealth. I learned that forgiveness is not about forgetting past injuries or pretending that harmful behavior was acceptable, but about choosing to focus on present possibilities rather than past disappointments. My parents would never become the loving, supportive figures I had needed during my childhood and young adulthood, but they could still become better people who contributed positively to other families and communities. Samuel's greatest gift to me was not his financial inheritance, but his example of how to live with integrity, generosity, and genuine concern for others. He had taught me that true wealth comes from the relationships you build and the positive impact you have on people's lives, rather than from the money you accumulate or the possessions you acquire. As I drove away from the cemetery that day, I felt Samuel's presence and approval in a way that was both comforting and inspiring. I knew that he would be proud of how his legacy was being used to create opportunities for young people who faced challenges similar to what I had experienced after my parents left. The Foundation would continue growing and expanding its impact for generations to come, ensuring that Samuel's values and generosity would benefit countless individuals who needed someone to believe in their potential. The inheritance lawsuit had forced me to defend not just my legal right to Samuel's estate, but also the principles and relationships that had shaped my character. The trial had been a public test of everything Samuel had taught me about loyalty, responsibility, and using resources wisely. Winning that test had been more valuable than any amount of money because it confirmed that I understood and could carry forward the most important parts of Samuel's legacy. Have you ever had to stand up for what you believed was right, even when it meant fighting against your own family members? What would you have done if you were in my position facing parents who had abandoned you but returned when money was involved? I would love to hear your thoughts about family loyalty, forgiveness, and how people can rebuild relationships after years of damage and neglect. Please share your experiences and opinions in the comments below. And do not forget to like this video if you found my story meaningful or helpful in your own life. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about overcoming family challenges and building positive legacies, and share this video with anyone who might benefit from hearing about resilience and redemption in difficult circumstances. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting the kind of authentic storytelling that helps people feel less alone in their struggles. I hope this experience will encourage you to prioritize the relationships and values that truly matter, rather than getting caught up in pursuits that ultimately leave you empty and disconnected from the people who love you most.